I'm Joeita, and this is The Pulse, a national study on the mental health of legal professionals in Canada confirms what was already known for years. Poor mental health impacts thousands of legal professionals each year. Alcohol and drug use amongst legal professionals is at worrying levels. Many legal professionals report significant mental distress, including depression, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts. The study found that over half, close to 55% of respondents, experience burnout on the job. Despite the prevalence of mental health concerns, few, if any, legal professionals sought professional help. The study also found that mental unwellness was an integral and normalized part of the legal culture. Thus, a systemic and wide-ranging effort must be made to improve the mental health of legal professionals. Today, we discuss mental health within the legal profession. It's time to put your finger on the pulse. Hello and welcome to The Pulse on AMI Audio. I'm Joeita, joining you from my home. This is now our third episode recording from home, and you can see behind me the record player and the records. As always, I am happy to join you today to talk about a very important topic, and one that I have heard about anecdotally from friends of mine who are lawyers or law students, and who have talked about the challenges of law school and trying to get established within the legal profession, and also struggling with their mental health and with invisible disabilities. The law can be, I think, a very promising area for social change. You know that I have, in my day job, worked in the law, and it's something that I feel inherently holds a great deal of promise to improve the lives of people for the better. But for actual professionals working within the law, it can be an often difficult and challenging reality where there's a great deal of fear about disclosing a disability, especially if that's an invisible disability or a mental health concern. There's a new book that'll be out at the end of April that hopes to illuminate some of these issues and help us all make sense of them. And to talk about the new book, which is called The Right Not to Remain Silent, The Truth About Mental Health in the Legal Profession, I'm joined by two of its three editors. Beth Beattie and Carole Dagher are both editors of this new volume of essays, and I am delighted to welcome both to the program today. Beth and Carole, hello, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Joeita. It's great to be here.
Same. Thank you so much.
Beth, let me start with you. Tell me in your own words about what this new book is all about.
The book is about normalizing the conversation about mental health in the legal profession and beyond. What we did, Carole and I came up with the book idea during a conversation Carole, about 18 months ago, where we shared our stories around lived experience. And we just thought, wouldn't our stories make great chapters of a book? And that's how it came about. And what we want to do, I think, I don't want to speak for Carole, but I think by sharing our stories so publicly in the legal community in the past few years, we've really made a great impact on people, that people feel less alone, that we're building a community of support of people with mental health issues who, despite our illnesses, are thriving in legal practice. And basically, we really do, from my perspective, I felt very alone for the 14 years that I hid my diagnoses. And now I'm going the polar opposite, where to share my story very publicly so that we build that community of support.
Carole, you've also been an editor on the book, and like Beth, you have also contributed to the book. Why, in your words, is the book so important now?
The book is very, very important, particularly now, for a number of reasons. I think we've all seen the impact that mental health has had on legal professionals, and that there is no resource or recourse for them to get help or to get accommodation. And mental health, in addition to climate change are the two biggest crises in the world today. And if we don't address both of them in a very constructive way, I'm afraid that these two world crises will really result in an unresolvable distress to our society. And I think it's critical that at this juncture, we all become transparently aware about the importance of accommodating and supporting those of us who have mental illnesses, and realizing that we are strong contributors to our communities. And without that recognition and that transparency, I think the global issue of mental illness will continue to be worsened. And so I think that, from my perspective, is a critical turning point for society, is that transparency and recognition of the damage that mental health has had on everyone globally.
Carole, you can hear the urgency in your voice as you're talking about this. And yet I have to ask you, if this is such a critical issue, whether or not people are on side with the idea of climate change, they are talking about it. Why is it that when we think about the legal profession in particular, why is it that we don't see broad-based conversations about mental health? I mean, I feel like maybe some of those conversations are happening now, but some would argue that those conversations are too little too late. What do you have to say in response?
It's such a great question, Joeita. I mean, I have my own perspective on this, and that perspective is that the legal profession is very exacting in its demand for high execution, professionalism, and almost perfection. And any sign of weakness in any of those areas would deem one to be an incompetent legal professional in the eyes of others. At least that is my view. And so I think there's been a really strong drive of those of us who are struggling to keep our struggle private so as not to be dismissed as a strong legal professional. And that really is the honest truth from my perspective, is that there's fear that we may be considered unhinged or incompetent or incapable of managing the high stress that comes from the legal profession. And so we keep going day in and day out with our invisible struggles. And so I think now the conversation has started, the doors creaking open, but we need to blow it open, because I think, if anything, this book has demonstrated that there are 18 very strong legal professionals who are contributors of our profession at one time or another in their careers. And that is despite and potentially because of their mental illness. There is strength in having challenges. There's resilience that comes out of challenge. And these authors are examples of taking challenge and becoming resilient and turning that into something that is meaningfully impactful in their own careers, the legal profession, and society at large.
Beth, Carole alluded to the fact that the book comprises 18 chapters, each of them written by a number of pioneers and movers and shakers in the legal profession. Some names are quite well known to all of us, but others maybe not so much. Can you give us an overview of some of the people we're hearing from in this book?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I just want to backtrack for a second. You're right that historically the legal profession has been silent on the topic of mental health. There was a sea change back in 2021 when the Law Society hosted a mental health summit for legal professionals. And we've had 3 summits already, and we're having a 4th on May the 7th. It's open to anyone. You don't have to be a lawyer. And each year we've had over 7,000 registrants. So that's about 10% of the lawyers and paralegals have come forward and watched the program. So we are seeing a change. And many of the 18 people who've written chapters of The Right Not to Remain Silent have spoken at the law summits. So in terms of who the people are, we start off the book with a beautiful essay by the former Chief Justice of Ontario, George Strathy, who really puts the feet to the fire in the legal community for addressing mental health issues, whether it's small town practitioners, in-house counsel, or big Bay Street lawyers, the changes that have to be made to make the legal profession more humane. So we get off to a great start with him. The second chapter, and I won't take you through all 18 chapters, but the second chapter is written by a judge out of Calgary, Madam Justice Michelle Hollins, who speaks very openly about living with depression. And then we have two Bay Street lawyers, and then we have small town practitioners. One of my favorite chapters is by a fellow, Michael Ferguson, who lives with depression and anxiety, and he lives in Goderich, Ontario, and everyone knows about his mental health, and yet he's still a successful lawyer. So, and we also have people talking about issues that haven't been spoken of before in the legal profession. So Courtney Wilson talks about living with a very severe eating disorder and what that was like for her at law school and then as a new lawyer. And similarly, we have a young woman talking about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is something that just hasn't been spoken of publicly before in our community. And then all sorts of things. We have bipolar, we have anxiety disorders, depression, the whole real gambit of mental health issues, including addiction, and a beautiful chapter on grief. Catherine Cooligan lost a little 5-month-old baby, and what her experience as a big Bay Street lawyer was to parallel becoming a new partner at a very successful firm to losing her child the same day.
I think the essays, each and every one of them, is so impactful in their own way. But Beth, you actually anticipated my next question, which was, and I'm still going to ask it. I was going to start my question by saying, and you've already alluded to the many summits that have taken place since 2021, and also the fact that I referenced a national study in my monologue of which you were a co-author. So clearly some of those conversations are already happening within the legal profession. Why then, Beth, would you say a book becomes so important? What does a set of 18 personal essays tell us that a summit cannot tell us? Or, a national study does not necessarily tell us? What does the book bring that is valuable and different?
I think the way we normalize the conversation around mental health in the legal community is to hear from practitioners who have lived experience. That's just the most impactful way, rather than having PowerPoint presentations by people who don't even have lived mental health experience pontificating on what mental health in the legal profession is, what the status of it is. We need to hear from people. With this book, people are going to hear those 18 stories and be able to savor them, go back to them, find the chapters that speak most to them, and not just to them, but to their family members, their colleagues, their friends. So it's difficult to have sort of lunch and learns and for people to remember the information that they're getting in that hour-long conversation, to actually have a physical book to be able to rely on, to highlight, go back through. We want these books to be well thumbed by people reviewing them in detail. So just having that physical presence of these beautiful stories is really going to make a difference compared to having slideshows to look at.
I just wanted to add to Beth's points, which I fully agree with, is, when someone puts pen to paper and writes words on a page, those words live on forever. They're memorialized in a book for my kids, my grandkids to read, and for others' kids and grandkids to read. And that is not a small thing to do when you're talking about suicidal ideation and you're talking about being an alcoholic, you're talking about going to the bathroom to vomit because you have anorexia or you're bulimic. For us to be this vulnerable and to have that vulnerability memorialized in eternity in a book is real evidence about how much we care about this issue getting noticed and getting addressed. None of us go around thinking, well, wouldn't it be great if we just exposed our innermost sensitive and critical challenges and pain? That is not a decision that was made lightly by any of the authors. This is a very difficult thing to do. And a lot of people went through a lot of pain, including myself, putting words down on a page. And so I think there's something really unique about having stories that you can pick up in a book and read. Those words jump out at you on a page, as opposed to hearing it at the Law Society or reading it as a research paper. Both forms are incredibly impactful, but there is something really emotional and deep and captivating when you actually read such personal accounts on a piece of paper.
Yes, it reminds you of the old feminist adage, the personal is political. Speaking of feminism, Carole, in many of the chapters of the book, people talk about things like postpartum depression, and, another person writes in their essay about experiencing incredible amounts of depression when their children leave for university. And we've already talked about Courtney Wilson's brave essay talking about her challenges with eating disorders. And the one thing that really stood out for me in that essay was, her belief that she was taken more seriously as a professional if she was, the thinner she got and the more weight she lost. How much do the issues around mental health within the legal profession intersect with broader conversations about sexism, homophobia, and racism?
What a great and hard question to answer. Let me start by saying that mental illness affects 1 in 4 Canadians. 1 in 4 could be a man or a woman or anything in between. And I would love for the day to come when mental illness is no longer a women's issue. Women are unhinged. They get their periods and they go nuts. They have a baby and they lose their marbles. Those are the perceptions. And I think we need to move away from those perceptions to recognize that it is actually a human issue. It is not a women's issue and it's not a man's issue. And that is why we took great, we went to great lengths to make sure that there are men and people of all sort of walks of life who are part of this book. Whether they identify as male or female is really irrelevant, because this is really sort of gender neutral issue. But having said all of that, I do think that women face unique challenges, just from a physical perspective. As I said, we give birth, we get our periods, we go through menopause and all kinds of things that aren't the same for men. And I think as a result of that, our chemistry lends itself to more sort of tendencies towards dealing with mental health challenges. And I do think that there is a perception out in the workforce about women not being able to handle stress as well as men, or that, women are expected to look and act a certain way. But I do think that there has been change, at least I see it. I don't subscribe to those beliefs or perceptions. I am who I am, regardless of what others perceive me to be. And I would love for the day to come where every woman can feel the same, that she is a voice at the table, that she deserves her seat at the table, not because she's a woman, but because she is smart and she has a lot of great value to bring to the table. But, I don't think the idea of sexism or discrimination is unique to law. I think this is a worldwide issue in every industry, quite frankly. And yes, law is not an exception.
Unique. Yeah, exactly. Beth, I have a friend, a young lawyer, who said to me, absolutely not. I am not ever going to disclose that I have a disability and a learning disability. I've had such a lot of blowback in the past is just turned everything upside down, and people think I'm incompetent and I'm starting a new job. If something really goes horribly, terribly wrong, then maybe I'll disclose that I have an invisible disability. Otherwise, I am not saying a word. And as much as we have these broad conversations about the need to address mental health within the legal professions, you've got lawyers, individual lawyers, often very vulnerable because they're just starting out in their careers, dancing on this knife's edge, deciding, do I disclose or don't I disclose? What do you have to say about that conversation about disclosure? Because, it's not like being blind because, I walk in with a white cane. The disclosure basically takes care of itself. There's no question about whether I disclose or I don't disclose. But when you're looking at mental health, it becomes that much more challenging because there is a question mark as to whether you come out with it and tell your colleagues and tell your manager.
Absolutely. The idea of disclosing one's invisible disability is an intensely personal decision. And I would never advise someone to disclose unless they really thought about it very carefully. I hid my illness really for 20 years. I talk about 14 years living with bipolar disorder, but even for a number of years before that, I was living with depression. So for 20 years of my practice, I did not disclose my illness. And I think it's incumbent on us as more senior people in the profession to speak openly because we have it easier, right? Like I decided to disclose once I became 50 years old. I was well established in my profession. I had been working at the same place for a number of years and they knew I was a good, hardworking lawyer. So it was relatively easy for me at that stage of my career to disclose. But for many years, again, I knew what the stigma felt like and that I was just not going to disclose. So I certainly understand that person's perspective. And again, it's why it's so important that we have in book form all of these stories so that we don't have anyone talking about a learning disability, but let's say it's someone with an eating disorder is very closeted at work. But if she reads Courtney Wilson's essay, she's going to feel comforted. She's going to feel less alone. She's going to feel empowered by reading about other people's experiences.
I know I cannot do this question justice in about 2 minutes, but that's really about as much time as we've got left. Beth, if you had to make some recommendations for where we could do the most good and how we can make the most impact in terms of changing the culture within the legal profession to be more accepting of mental health concerns, where do you want to see change happen?
With my experience, the best thing that ever happened was that two of us from the Ministry of the Attorney General got together and had a conversation about what we could do to reduce stigma at the ministry. So we reached out to 4 other people who had lived mental health experience, who we had direct contact with, who we knew were willing to talk openly about their experiences. So the 2 of us became a conversation of 6 of us. And together we started putting on a bunch of education sessions. We've now done over 50 of them. And it was getting that core group of people, that core community together to not just put on programs, but to make those of us who were members of, we call ourselves Voices for Mental Health, to not feel alone and to have some armor around us, because as a result of us being a group of people, it meant that we were support for one another. So we just have not, or certainly I have not, felt the sting of stigma, because even if there might be a negative comment out there, I can go to my colleagues and know that I'm going to feel supported. So we need those conversations to start in all like law offices across the land, and not just law offices, accountants, doctors, nurses, and so on, to just start those kernels of conversations and let them grow.
Carole, I'm going to put the last question of the day to you, and sadly I can't, we can only do another minute more. Why is this conversation so important, not just to the legal community, but to ordinary people who might be the clients or people who might appear in front of a judge? Why does the mental health of lawyers and judges become so important in the practice of the law from the point of view of ordinary people who are not lawyers?
I think, as I said earlier, 1 in 4 people suffer. And I think lawyers and judges are viewed as superheroes. But, once you understand that even we can encounter mental health challenges, it normalizes that for everyone else. I think the other important aspect is that there are caregivers out there who look after those of us who are struggling. And this is sort of an ode to them as well, to say, thank you very much for your support. We couldn't do it without you.
Thank you very much. Beth and Carole, I really appreciated having you both on the show. Thanks so much for taking a few minutes out of your busy schedules to chat with me about this.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joeita.
There go Beth Beattie and Carole Dagher, the editors of a new volume of essays called The Right Not to Remain Silent, The Truth About Mental Health in the Legal Profession, a really fantastic set of essays, which I hope you have a chance to pick up and read when the book becomes available on April 30th. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today. If you have any feedback for us, write to us at feedback@ami.ca. You can find us on X, formerly Twitter, @AMI Audio, and use the hashtag PulseAMI. You are also welcome to leave us a voicemail by calling 1-866-509-4545. That's 1-866-509-4545. And don't forget to leave permission to play the audio on the program. If you have any comments about this show or previous episodes of The Pulse, feel free to write them down below if you're listening on YouTube or following the podcast. And if you haven't already done so, please don't forget to subscribe so you can be notified about future episodes of The Pulse, which drop every weekend. As I said, it's time to run. This particular episode has given me a lot to think about, and I assume it's given you a lot to think about. So with that, I'm going to take my leave of you. Our technical producer is Mark Aflolo. Ryan Delahanty is the coordinator for AMI Audio Podcasts. Andy Frank is the manager for AMI Audio. And I've been your host, Joeita Gupta. Thanks so much for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day.